have I mentioned them all? Have I missed a giant?
There's so Rumblebuffin, Wimbleweather, Stonefoot is another one that's mentioned by name. But there seems to be, and this is interesting, right? Because C.S. Lewis isn't as meticulous in his world building as Tolkien is, right? No. And so he kind of jams everything in there. But like that's part of his methodology, is being open to, right, the gathering in of kind of a number of different myths and kind of putting them all together in a little kind of playpen to have fun with, and to saying that all of that is imbued, that all of these are essentially kind of coming from the same great capital M myth when it comes to it. So he felt free to just kind of pull from everywhere, right, and to keep those explicitly distinct in their original forms. But what Lewis, I don't know if he's intentionally or unintentionally, he almost sets up a few different kind of categories of giants, right? So you have the Narnian giants, who are the ones that seem to be like native to and live in Narnia, are kind, generally speaking, but just not very bright. But you have a few rogue giants that are part of the witches' army in that initial fight, that we have between those groups in Lion Witch and the Wardrobe. But then once you get into Silver Chair, which is going north, then you have those Ettinsmore, the Ettin, these large, they're huge. They seem to be unintelligent, violent, terrible aim, like you mentioned. But it's said they could have like additional heads and arms sometimes. They seem to be kind of more monstrous creatures. We're not told if they're speaking any sort of language, if they speak Narnian, something else, or nothing at all. Whereas when you get to Harfang, those giants appear to be kind of smaller in scale. Certainly, they seem different because they have a government system, a social structure, hierarchy, and they're not as massive. At least,
and they have cookbooks.
Right. They have cookbooks, so they're civilized. Yeah, they're civilized. they have cookbooks, and so they're so you have kind of. So I don't know if these are social distinctions between giants, or if they're biological distinctions. These are different trajectories. But what's happening in Harfanger is clearly kind of different from what's happening on Ettinsmore, when they're running from those giants. So they're a little bit smaller, more civilized, and they're devious, right? So they're intelligent, and you get kind of the wily, like you were mentioning, Julia, with the Green Knight, where he's not a giant in the sense of the kind of oafish, bumbling, just large size, is kind of size and strength being its largest defining feature, but rather he's kind of this blend of cunning, right, and of intelligence, sometimes hyper intelligence in the way that they're strategizing, and you do have that more with the giants specifically that are in that castle there, Castle Harfang. So you have those, but then you have Father Time that they see sleeping underground there in Silver Chair. So I'd love to hear, your thoughts on Father Time there, and what you think is happening there in terms of him being referenced as a giant, and what if there's shifting, or what you think Lewis is doing with that.
Yeah, so that's the kind of giant you don't want to wake up, because he is woken up, isn't he, in the last battle, and that's the end of time. And that reminds me of some of the more folkloric giants. It's later, but there's a fantastic book called The Giant Under the Snow, a children's book by, I think it's John Gordon, which has this idea of there is a giant. They looked at the old earthworks, the sort of Iron Age earthworks, and thought, this looks like human, a shape. And so the idea of if you rouse the sleeping giant, you cause the end of an age or some sort of cataclysm. And I think that's what's going on there, the sense of, it's like the world started with the Norse god who was turned into the world. Well, it sort of ends with one as well, calling time, literally calling time. So I feel that's a sort of folkloric northern giant creeping into the world of Narnia there.
Yeah, that's the Father Time was fascinating. So when I first read Silverchair, that's what, like, I stopped on that. Sometimes, there's certain ideas that you just kind of have to like stop and chew on for a minute before you kind of keep going. But then this idea of, Father Time personified, and that he'd, once, as the children are asking, who is this? What is that? And then you get this kind of quick snapshot of a backstory where he ruled a kingdom somewhere in early Narnia, and then eventually kind of sank down into the underland and put to sleep. And you have all these birds and bats and dragons and lizards there, but he's, clearly massive and held in respect, which you don't have that sort of respect. I think does it describe it almost as like a chapel that he's kind of sleeping within. The room is there seems to be some sort of care that's given to him as an individual, this kind of Father Time. And so that arrested me at first. And then when that same character comes back in the last battle, just all of those sections, I had to, kind of reread each of those, just the description of him. So he's clearly different, in a different category from these other giants. Right. It says his description in Last Battle, his face was not like a giant's, but noble and beautiful, right? So the assumption is that giants are ugly, right? Or hideous creatures, but this one wasn't, right? He's noble. He's got this, huge snowy beard, and then a pure silver light rested upon him, though no one could see where it came from. So he's kind of illuminated from some unknown source. He's kind of this sense of kind of, I want to say holiness, but certainly it's kind of like mythic weight to him, even in the way he's lit. It kind of, sets him apart. And he ends up, like you were saying, it's a really fascinating parallel between the Norse myths, where the world is created from the body of this giant, and then here it's this giant that ultimately ends Narnia, right? In that particular world, by squeezing the sun like an orange, and brings an end to that. And presumably, right, he dies outside. He's left outside of the world as it dies, but then presumably he's kind of brought into the other, the true Narnia.
Yes, but he also represents the physical property of time, doesn't he? That the world that they go into in the last battle is a place outside of time. It's eternity.
So the question is,
this is where we get into the philosophy of it, and also it reminded me that, of course, of the biblical roots of giants and the idea of huge creatures that are sort of, as in the book of Daniel, there are lots of very large, I wouldn't call them traditional giants, but large prophetic creatures that are sort of instruments of God's power. So I feel that Father Time feels like a kind of instrument of Aslan's power in that world, in a more almost biblical way, that sort of fits with the Revelation film feel of that last book.
That's really interesting, because you do have, right, in Daniel, this figure seen in vision, that different parts of clay and iron and right, the different types of metals, all representing successive kingdoms. And so that is so it's this person is a personification of time. And perhaps that you have it, because Lewis is playing so fast and loose, and I think that's the fun of Lewis, is that this creature could be an actual moving creature that can squish a sun in its hand, in its massive hand, but also can serve as the embodiment of time itself, of linear time itself. And so there's kind of this interplay that is very mythic, right? So he's writing in that mode where you can be both and it's not necessarily one specific creature, but it's playing with ideas as well as kind of with like more concrete realities. And you see this, and where I saw this when I was thinking about giants in Lewis outside of Narnia, thinking about The Great Divorce and that surreal kind of closing chapter where the narrator sees these giant creatures, specifically, right, a great assembly of gigantic forms that are around these, like, it looks like a chessboard, and they're moving these little pieces on the chessboard. And what the narrator is told, talking with George MacDonald, right, as his kind of psychopomp spirit guide, is that the people, these gigantic figures, are actually human souls, right? They're the spirits, they're the lived reality, and that these kind of tiny pawns are the kind of physical manifestations of people, so that each person is so much larger and grander and is part of something larger outside of time, and that this board that's representing time, these people, these tiny small figures are just kind of being moved about, that's a separate realm, and the experience that those people are involved with is different from the kind of transcendent reality outside of that kind of plane of time. So I absolutely agree with you there.
I'm now going to earn some bonus points here, because what you've just said reminds me of The Place of the Lion, the fascinating Charles Williams novel, which has the idea of the Platonic archetypes, which are gigantic versions of. So a lion is the essence of lion, a huge lion, and the butterfly is the essence of butterflies and beauty, which sucks everything. It sort of threatens the world. These giant creatures, a giant snake as well, they threaten our reality by sucking everything into them. That's the sort of the dilemma of that fascinating novel. So there seems to be a philosophical level here, which the giant form is working on in both Lewis and Charles Williams, which I think I'm going to have to think about a bit more, but there seems to be a connection. Certainly the sort of the idea of ending, having the power to end reality, seems to be quite a strong correlation there. Okay, so we've done quite a deep dive into giants in Tolkien, giants in C.S. Lewis, dip into Charles Williams. Where do we think giants have gone now? We've seen them in Sir Gawain in The Green Knight. We've seen them in, and we can mention other Arthurian tales, just wave at them in passing. We've seen them in Gulliver's Travels. I'm trying to think if there's any connecting hopscotch we can do here. I mean, obviously there was fairy tales and the whole era of fairy tales that came along with Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen and others. But we have had an explosion of giants in contemporary culture, if we think about it. So have at the idea of the contemporary giant. I've got one big franchise in mind. I'll see if you come up with the same one.
I'll leave the Wizarding World to you then. Is that the
Oh,
one
no, I wasn't going to do that, but well done. Let's do quick.
Right.
I completely forgotten that. Yes, let's do that. So we've got J.K. Rowling giants. Obviously, we've got Hagrid as our favorite.
Right, who's half giant, right?
Yeah. But we do have a connection here to the dim giants, don't we? The dim and vicious giants, because they do tend to be on that end of the scale, with the honourable exception of the headmistress of Beauxbaton School, who seems quite refined. But the others all seem quite persuaded by Voldemort.
Right. Yeah. That they're dull. Right. Yeah. That Grop, Hagrid's half brother, that's full giant, is clearly dim. And with that, you see, and so kind of how giants, come back to our point about how giants kind of can be used symbolically and sometimes morally, in a sense, as we saw with the Greek myths, giants kind of being used morally in a sense, or philosophically. You have a prejudice in the Wizarding world against giants, where they're treated, as second-class citizens. So there's kind of metaphor of being used, again, like the other, and the, our favorite, Maxime, the headmistress, when Hagrid is talking to her and confiding, like, it's finally nice to find somebody who is also, he kind of has the same heritage. She gets really upset and says, like, are you suggesting that I'm giant, in essence, right? So so is she, and this is something that I'm talking about this with my wife, who knows the Harry Potter books better than anyone I know. She was saying, that in a sense, she seems to be trying to pass as non-giant. And so once she's kind of called out as having that heritage, so there's then she gets very upset. She's extra defensive about that. And so you have that almost giant kind of being used as a social metaphor for, social classes that are seen as, secondary citizens. And that comes across in how giants are spoken of by other people in the Wizarding world. Cornelius Fudge, for instance. So anyway, so there's, so Wizarding world, you have those ones. Other ones that I was thinking of, Neverending Story, Michael Ende, the rock biter. So kind of, I was thinking about that, especially in light of the, our listeners' reference to the stone giant, this literally giant made out of stone who eats rocks. And that creature, again, this like kind of more cosmic, massive, who dies, who's end up, we see fleeing from the end of reality, as we know it within this world of the story of the titular never-ending story. So that's another one that came to mind as one that, especially in the film version of that, because I saw that film so many times when I was younger, that was kind of the quintessential massive cosmic giant was Stone, the rock biter from Neverending Story. So your turn.
Okay, I'm going to just do one more stone giant. My absolute favorite is in Galaxy Quest, which also happens to be possibly my favorite film. It's certainly my desert island film, because there is a literal rock giant, which is used for great comic effect, because the hero has to fight this stone giant and everyone's giving him advice, and he's basically saying, well, look, he's rock, what am I supposed to do? It's a very, very funny sequence, and it seems to go right back to the very origin of rocks that become a giant. Nice and simple, very funny, and has a great twist. I'm not going to spoil it for those of you who haven't watched it yet, but put it on your to watch list. Has a great twist in how it's used in a brilliant way as the plot unravels. Okay, no, the franchise I was going to suggest is the biggest, pun intended, of giant franchises, is the Transformer one. Because the Transformers, which also connect to toys and children's imagination and manipulation of vehicles, big trucks and things like that, into robots, seem to me to be, they're huge. It always astounds me how the Transformer movies make so much money every time they come up, but there must be something incredibly appealing in that very concept of something mechanical that is sentient, and obviously got the good ones and the bad ones, but they can change and disguise themselves. But then you've got the problem of a big creature in a small space. So I think the one I watched most recently was the one that was called Bumblebee, which is one of the smaller of the Transformers. The most fun scene in that one is when the car kind of is inside the house trying to do things but doesn't have the fine motor skills, and everything just gets trashed. It's like the worst kind of teenage nightmare where the house is trashed while mum and dad are away. So the Transformers have a lot of fun with playing on a sort of technological giant.
That's good. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that when you mentioned that earlier, that Transformers as kind of a contemporary giant. But there's clearly, that there's something, not all children, I can't say that, but I know, with my own child, we have a 2-year-old, and he just gravitated towards big trucks and cars. We don't teach him. We're trying to raise him, on classical literature, and he's just like obsessed with garbage trucks. So it's hard to feel like I'm succeeding as a parent when they're, discarding, Alice in Wonderland for dump trucks. But it'll come. Right. But there's something, but I think there's something that to, children's minds, that's something that's large. And I think why, perhaps one of the reasons why vehicles in particular is because they're moving, right? They seem to be moving. They seem to be living in some way, shape, or form that the child can't understand, right? They're not people, but they're large and they're moving around. And so there's something to be fascinated with, perhaps, terrified and fascinated with at the same time. But then giving those a greater personification in the Transformers, which again was one of my childhood. That's what I was raised on, was Transformer cartoons and toys, and that was my world. And so thinking about that as that they become more anthropomorphic with the toys themselves and the creatures, because it's easier to relate to something that has a head and arms and legs than it is to a four-wheeled vehicle, right? So I think that's one of the things, you're right, that like maybe tapping into something deeper with children that they're fascinated with, that could account for the success of Transformers. So bravo for thinking in that in that direction.
Well, you also, I feel like we're playing pinball and just little ideas are sort of flashing up with extra bonus points here, because you just mentioned Alice in Wonderland, and I was saying, oh, what happens about perspective?
Right.
And of course, Alice does this. She grows and she shrinks, and she spends part of Alice in Wonderland being too big, and that's a problem, and she has to get small again. That is another, I suppose that's feels like the Gulliver Travels experience brought forward into a famous, really the granddad of fantasy literature here in Oxford. So a little wave to Alice in Wonderland as we go past. But we would be remiss of us if we didn't mention the sort of DC and Marvel universe of all of this. Right. The one that I immediately thought of was the Hulk, because obviously that is a transformational thing of a human, sort of relatively weedy, no, not really weedy, but a sort of normal man who then becomes this enormous giant, and that's the giant fueled with rage, and it sort of clues into that idea of it's a primal side of us that is released. The kind of Mr. Hyde version of us when we spend most of our life as Dr. Jekyll. So that seems to be a connection to those primal giants we mentioned. Though, of course, what they've done with him since in things like Thor Ragnarok, they're always changing in these comic series. So it's a moving target we're talking about.
Right. And that's one thing I think is fascinating with the Hulk in particular, is starts out as, like you're saying, this dimension of humanity that's just kind of the brutish, unintelligent, speaking, monosyllabic creature. And whereas then you have in the movies, you have, right, this kind of fusing of the intelligence, hyper intelligence of the scientist that the Hulk grows into to become his charmingly brutish, large green self. But in the comics, you have different versions, right? So you have this green Hulk, and then you have a second iteration that's this gray Hulk, where he has the Hulk size and strength, but retains the intellect of the scientist. So he's this hyper intelligent, massive creature, and that's kind of what they're kind of melding those traditions in the comic together in the films, where in the contemporary present day Marvel timeline, you have this hyper intelligent, large, hulking creature. So Hulk is a great example, I think, of playing with different dimensions of the giant trope. You also have that with the Thing of the Fantastic Four in Marvel, looking at Marvel specifically, who's
rock giant.
This
he's
brutish.
A rock giant. Yes.
Right.
He's got
he's rockish. Exactly. Yeah. So so good, another connection to rock related elemental kind of creatures. But he's his intelligence, because he's originally a football kind of beefy athlete, college athlete, who then develops this super strength and super rocky skin. So you have and you also have, bringing in both the comic books and the films, Ant-Man, right? So is dealing with size. So again, when you mentioned Alice in Wonderland, the growing and shrinking, you have that same sort of trope in Ant-Man, where he can change his size, right? This is one of perspective. So he's tiny, can go inside individual molecules, inside human bodies, but then also can can become 10 stories tall, 20 stories tall, and completely massive. And it's one of perspective and size. So you have the superhero who is originally kind of as Ant-Man, in the comics becomes Goliath because he kind of reverses the process for becoming small, and then it lives as a giant for a while, and then you have that variance of size and perspective. And it seems like Marvel, compared to DC, is paying greater attention to those large scale issues of in size with heroes. There aren't, most of the giants in DC are lesser known characters, not any of the kind of headliners, like you can say with Marvel, with Hulk and Thing, and Ant-Man / Goliath, who he is in the comics, at least when he's huge. But you have Giganta, who's this giant woman, Atom Smasher, Anti-Monitor, but they kind of like be at the risk of offending fictional characters. They seem like B and C list superheroes and supervillains that get the giant card, who draw that in their kind of creation. But one of the things that kind of connects us back to, I feel, kind of thematically, to Tolkien and Lewis, Tolkien in particular, is DC's Swamp Thing, who is a creature that's made out of vegetation, right? Who's this kind of embodiment of who originally was kind of this horror creature, who is, a human that became a walking plant creature. But then in the comics themselves, he becomes this kind of avatar for the world of vegetation and trees, right? The green itself is this realm that he kind of inhabits, and he's kind of the go-between between the natural world and the world of humans. And this creature, he can change sizes as well. Sometimes he can be massive. There's one spot where he actually visits Gotham City to rescue someone, and he swells in size to dwarf the buildings beneath him, but also can be smaller. It's variable because he's a plant at heart, but I think it's very similar to the Treebeard, right? As this kind of avatar, in a sense, a spokes tree. Is that the right word? A spokes tree for the natural world, and kind of the go-between, a go-between between the world of humans, right? When we're talking with Merry and Pippin, Treebeard is kind of the our go-between, our psychopomp, if you will, helping them in some ways understand what's at stake for the natural world in these larger battles that are happening. That's what I think is that you see that happening more thematically in DC with the Swamp Thing character, and they have the Parliament of Trees that functions with its own mythology. But it's more evocative to me of Tolkien and what he was doing with the giant tree figures than anything else.
I bet a number of people listening to this are shouting Groot, because there's another character who seems very Entish. So it's impossible, obviously, to mention everybody's favorite giant, but I think we should just do a quick nod to the sort of Roal Dahl world of giants, the big friendly giant, and that world where you've got giants as quite benign figures. So it's the picture books, for example, which my children, the one about George the giant who gives away his clothes. I don't know if you know that story. It's a wonderful. So he starts off finely dressed, and gradually he's the kindest giant, and he gives away his clothes, and he's able to clothe an entire village as a result. So there are those sorts of sweet, benign giants as well, which may be a nice place to sort of to end after having seen some horrors on our journey. So we always have a where in all the worlds. And the obvious question, Jacob, is which fantasy world is it best to be one of these giants? By the way, I also noticed there's a definite lack of female giants. I mean, the Entwives are missing.
Right.
Most of the ones we mentioned are either sort of neutral sex or... I mean, to be fair, Lewis has a whole castle of mixed gender giants. Right. But on the whole, it seems to be a masculine place to be a giant, really. Anyway, where would you like to be a giant?
It seems like the place with the least amount of underlying prejudice against giants is Narnia. That seems to be the place that seems most accommodating or open to dealing with giants in at least a semi-civilized way. So if I was a giant, that's probably where I'd have to land.
Yeah,
I hate to say that because I want to come up with something better, but it just seems, for my sake, purely selfish, for purely kind of logistical reasons, Narnia seems like the only place I can think of.
I think I'll probably go quite old school. I think I'll go for the world of Sir Gawain in the Green Knight, because he does have a whole castle and a court and sort of mystic powers. So I think I'd quite like to be, and also you seem pretty eternal because you get your head cut off and you pop up again. So,
right.
I think that might be a good option. But on the whole, I think fantasy worlds are pretty rough on giants.
Yeah, they don't seem, so they're typically, right. So you rarely, I can't really think of many where you have giants held up as symbols of virtue, nobility, right? That they're true
in Pilgrim's Progress. In Pilgrim's Progress, it's the giant of despair. I mean, they really get a poor billing in that book too, and they get outwitted.
So maybe that's a challenge for. Exactly, and I think that'd be a challenge for those of our listeners who are also authors and storytellers to come up with a scenario. I would love to read a story that kind of turns that tendency and trope on its head of a heroic, a giant who is held up, whose virtues are held up in some way. It'd be hard to do, I think, just because of the kind of overwhelming cultural weight that's placed on giants. But I think that'd be worth seeing. I'd love to see it.
Okay, that's the challenge. That's the homework.
And a female giant. So this would be a female giant who's held up as a symbol of virtue, nobility, honor.
I have actually done this in one of my books. I've written a couple of books called the Mel Foster series, and Mel Foster teams up with Eve Frankenstein, who is daughter of Frankenstein. They sort of have an almost graphic novel feel to it, these books, and she is the virtuous. She is the good guy in this. I only make her about 7 or 8 feet tall, so her logistical problems are not too big, because otherwise you spend all your time working out how you get someone in a building. But she was my attempt to both correct the gender imbalance and also give giants a better billing. So,
and I'm embarrassed that I haven't read that yet. So okay, I would say, fine. So plug that. Where can we find that?
You can find it online. In bookshops and
wherever good.
Yeah, but that was my attempt.
Which are the books?
Anyway,
yeah. What's the titles? Yeah, what are the titles of those? Just for my
own. The first one is called Mel Foster. Well, the series is the Mel Foster's Monsters, and the second one is very H.G. Wells inspired. It's Mel Foster and the Time Machine. So the first one is Mel Foster and the Demon Butler. That's it. Because that's about an evil butler takes over Queen Victoria. And the second one is Mel Foster and the Time Machine. I have to struggle to remember. I've written over 60 novels, so I sometimes get my titles a bit muddled. But they don't all have giants. That one does.
Okay, good. Well, check it out.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And that was really fun. I think we covered the territory on giants, but I'm sure other people will have more suggestions about themes that we could tackle, and we'll happily return and have a go at something else. Because we didn't even touch on giant creatures, King Kong,
no.
Godzilla. I mean, there's a whole other world of fantasy creatures out there.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.
Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F-words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic!
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.